Our featured guest tonight is a fantastic actor, voice artist, and master of impressions. His incredible career has placed him in so many major comedy series over the past 20 years that he's worked with just about everyone who's anyone in the industry. His recent dramatic work in films and shows like Frost Nixon, Gaslit, and Hunters has introduced him to a whole new audience, and you can currently find him in his recurring role of Kerry Hubbard on Apple Plus's The Big Door Prize. Here to chat about his incredible career, comedy, and everything else in between is the wonderful Jim Meskimen. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, David. It's nice to be here. I'm sorry I'm so underdressed, but I feel a little bit like I'm meeting with my attorney. But
well, the irony is that's my other gig, so
okay.
That kind of fits in. So I often start off asking guests about their childhood and hometowns to kind of help my audience get to know each guest's roots and how they eventually found their way into their respective professions. Now, I know you weren't raised actually in Hollywood, but you were kind of raised around Hollywood. What was life like growing up for a kid in that environment?
The environment that we could call Hollywood is more transcendent than that. And certainly, since my mother was a working actress who worked in Hollywood herself, even though we lived in a suburb and I still basically live in the same place, you feel like you have a connection to it as much as anybody who actually lives on Melrose, say. So, yeah, I grew up in an environment where my mother, who became the iconic Mrs. C on Happy Days, but who was just a struggling actress when I was most of my childhood. My mother raised me and my sister here, mostly as a single mom. My folks were divorced when I was 8, and she was a great, great mom. Very different from Mrs. C. I don't know anybody that was really raised by Mrs. C, although a whole generation of people think that they were raised by Mrs. C, which I find kind of amusing.
So, and your mom she did work alongside some of the greats in the industry from time to time, like Cary Grant and Tony Curtis to Clayton Moore and Donna Reed. Did you have any conception as a kid as to how kind of special that was?
Well, I didn't know so much about the older performers for quite a while, and then now, of course, it's like, oh my God, you worked with Noel Coward and Clark Gable and those other ones you mentioned. And it's kind of staggering. I mean, she went to Humphrey Bogart's house one time for a reading, and it's never to be repeated kind of event. But I did know that, I guess by virtue of the fact that she was an actress and on TV, I did know that she was kind of special. There weren't a ton of kids at my school whose parents were in show business, or that I was aware of anyway, and in my grade, let's say. So I did feel kind of like just a little bit of like, my mom is kind of special, but nothing crazy, because she was not a well-known name or face, but she had been on pretty much all those shows in the 60s, Mission Impossible, The Brady Bunch, Longstreet, the endless string of detective shows and Westerns that really make up the menu of the 60s and 70s prior to Happy Days. So, yeah, I felt like we had a little bit of sparkle on us.
Now, when I guess you were in your mid-teens when your mom was cast as Marion Cunningham on Happy Days. What do you remember about when your mom got that role? I mean, do you remember how you guys found out about it? And did you guys have a feeling that the show was going to be a massive success at the time, or was it just like any other new show? We'll just hope it clicks and cross our fingers.
Well, of course, I think I was 12 or 13, so pretty young, not knowing much about the business, really. Didn't know what a pilot was exactly, so we didn't. And I don't think my mother was terribly genned in on it either. I'd done a lot of TV, but she hadn't done a lot of pilots, hadn't been up for a lot of big jobs before. And the way that Happy Days rolled out, I learned later by reading a book by Gary Marshall, who created the show. And he goes into great detail about those times and what actually happened, what the progress was of that project. And, it didn't just like sell and then become a series. It actually languished for about a year, which is a pretty long time, and kind of died and then got resuscitated with the success of American Graffiti, which also starred Ron Howard. So by a bizarre turn of events, it went from being a totally unvaluable piece of content to something that was intensely valuable. And so we didn't obviously know what was going on with all this stuff. And I only found out years later. But I do remember watching the first episode when it was a proper series. And we went over to my mother's manager's house and we watched that. And it was kind of cool, but no inkling that, well, this will be the opening to the gateway of a whole new life, which it essentially became for my mom and for my family. And, it just continues to boggle the mind a little bit, how much that series and that character, her character, means to people still, and that they still have a lot of love and affinity for what she represented.
Was it there that you made an initial connection with Ron Howard, or did that come later?
No, that is exactly where I met him. I mean, I met him on the set of Happy Days at Paramount Studios. I met him and Don Most and Anson Williams, his second wedding I just went to this weekend with my wife, and Henry Winkler and Tom Bosley and all those guys. And I met them just, working guys, very young. I was, as I said, 12 or 13. I can't quite remember. And Ron was probably 18. So, yeah, that's where I made friends with them. And, I was just a kind of a kid that occasionally came to the set with his mom. And later on, I was lucky enough to audition for Ron. He knew I was an actor. He'd seen me in some things. And then he invited me to audition for a movie. And I wound up doing 5 different films for him.
When did the creativity bug first hit you growing up?
Well, I've been a recipient of, creativity, whatever, if you want to call it the muse or whatever. I've been involved with creating things ever since I can remember. So the great thing about Marion, my mom, who was probably similar to Marion Cunningham, was that she indulged and tolerated my creative urges and my impulses, and I think fostered a lot of them too. Introduced me to things, took me to museums, gave me pencils and pens and crayons, and not so much musical. My dad was more musical, but Marion was very visually oriented and theatrically oriented. So voices, dialects, and things like that, and cartooning and all that stuff. She definitely encouraged me. When I guess I demonstrated an affinity and an aptitude pretty early, and I really thought I was going to be a cartoonist illustrator, and I worked very hard in that area. And as a visual artist, prior to really making a commitment to acting, I worked as a professional, and I still draw and paint today just for my own pleasure.
Were you always good at impressions, or did that come later?
Well, as a 4-year-old, I wasn't so good. I just didn't have it, Yep. Tried. Did The Cowardly Lion. And I remember when I was about 7 or 8, maybe, and Tiny Tim was very big. Remember Tiny Tim?
Yeah, with the guitar and
it was a ukulele and
yeah,
and stringy long hair and a big old beak on him. And he was a really unlikely celebrity who just dominated this certain shows in the 60s. And he would play and sing, and he'd play these old, public domain songs from the 20s.
He did like
through the tulips, by the willow tree. And I remember as a kid trying to imitate him and being able to do it pretty well, because of course he sang in falsetto, and as a kid it was not very far to go. So I've always approached impressions out of curiosity and a wanting to know and a wanting to feel what it's like to be like that person, and I still do that today. So it turned out to be something that, although I didn't plan it at all, it turned out to be a way to make a living.
Do you have one that's your personal favorite?
I'll tell you what, I do that George W. Bush quite often on account of he was a famous president. But I like doing the one that at the moment that feels like it's fun to do and that gets a rise out of people. I tell you, people love Robin Williams a lot. When you do Robin Williams, they get a kind of a little, their heart skips a beat a little bit because it means something. And it's funny that he got his start on my mom's show on Happy Days, Mork from Ork, as his first appearance. But lately, I've also been doing an awful lot of Patrick Stewart, because people have a lot of fondness for Patrick Stewart. And the older I get and the younger he gets, the more we tend to look alike. So I've got that going for me.
And you've got some, real fan favorites in your arsenal. Obviously, Robin Williams is one of them. And it seems like everybody's got their own Christopher Walken. But yours is kind of aged with him, right?
Yes, I mean, I have the advantage of being just, I think he's probably 10 years older, maybe. But for whether it's the way my face is growing or my mind is dissipating, I find we link up a lot more than we used to.